Good evening, everyone, and welcome. You know, as I was putting my thoughts together for tonight, you can't help but think back and realize we've come through a year and a half like no other. And, I was reading a book by Jeff Immelt. He was the recently retired head of GE, or General Electric. And he used this term, he used the term tail risk. And he said tail risk is what is basically something that's unlikely to happen, but then it does happen. And I guess we've come through some tail risk. It was unlikely to happen, but it did happen. But I think after a year and a half, the good news is we're still here. We're still standing. Our needs have been met, and God is still on the throne, and his work is going forward, and that's really, really good news. And, just to talk to you for a minute in the house and online, people say to me, what's it like just to have to speak to the choir? Don't the people that need to hear your stuff, they're the ones that aren't here. But you know what? We forget how important the choir is. If Birkeland Tabernacle had never had a choir, you never would have heard of Birkeland Tabernacle or Jim Cymbala. The choir is hugely influential. You're hugely influential people. The things that we talk about here are things that you take out and live out and influence so many people. So just while I'm speaking to the choir, the first thing I want to say is thank you. You're the people, by and large, that have prayed during this time. You've served, stepped up to the plate, and you've given money and given your time, and that's hugely, hugely significant. And so I think it's important that you know that as leadership, we're grateful and we're humbled by what you've done during this time, which has been a year like no other. I want tonight to, I want to say one thing, remind you of one thing that's hugely important, and then I want to raise two questions that I call critical questions. So I'll remind you of one thing that's hugely important, and I'll raise two critical questions. When I didn't start out to be a pastor, and when Jeannie and I were married 2 years and working for my dad and in real estate, and a church approached us. We were living in Regina. A church approached us in North Van and said, would you consider coming in and being a youth pastor? And I thought, I'll go out and do that for a couple of years and then I'll come back. And went out to North Van, and when we arrived there, I realized I had no idea what a pastor was or what a pastor did. And the senior pastor was as useless as I am at supervising people, so he didn't know how to grow me. And so I had to figure it out myself. And so I did two things. I attached myself to a few people that, one, I knew that they knew God. I wanted to know how they knew God. And the second thing I did was I figured out what I might be good at, and I just read everything, went to every seminar I could in the areas that I thought I might be able to grow into. So basically, I mentored myself for the most part, but one of the people that I attached myself to in a very significant way by taking his classes, reading his books. He's been in our home. Was a professor I had, Dr. Packer, and he recently died. He died in July 2020, July 17th, 2020, at 93 years of age. And you wonder what this has to do with the thing I want to remind you of. Well, his last class he taught, he was 90 years old. It was the summer school in June 2016 at Regent College. And somebody asked him from the college just before that class, they said, what do you hope to achieve in this course of students? You're 90 years old, you got this class, what do you hope to achieve? And this was his answer, and I want to put it up on the screen for you because every line is worth pondering. If you don't have it on the screen, I think I have a copy of it here somewhere. I thought I did. Hang on. Is it on the screen behind me or no? Let me read it to you. Let me just read it to you. This is what he said. Someone said, what do you hope to achieve in this course? This 90-year-old man. He said, look, this is the biggest thing that ever was. And we Christians, most of us, still haven't appreciated its size. We've been Christians for years and years, and yet we haven't fully grasped it. But it's that line, this is the biggest thing that ever was. He was talking about the gospel. He was talking about the mission of the church. He's talking about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. He said, this is the biggest thing ever. And I want to remind you of that because when you go through something like COVID, sometimes the biggest thing ever gets diminished. And COVID becomes the biggest thing ever. Or sometimes we go through a disease like cancer and it becomes the biggest thing ever. Or sometimes this happens or that happens, becomes the biggest thing ever. The biggest thing ever is the gospel of Jesus and the mission that he's entrusted to the church, and that hasn't changed. I want to remind you of that. That hasn't changed. COVID didn't take Jesus by surprise. And the biggest thing is still the biggest thing, or sometimes as we put it here, the main thing is still the main thing. Now, why do I want to remind you that tonight? Well, because when that gets diminished, or when we lose sight of the biggest thing ever, what happens is, often at least, relationships begin to break down because our own personal interests and agendas begin to rise to a level that they shouldn't. And so relationships can begin to break down. And when the biggest thing ever is no longer the biggest thing ever, we tend to lose our purpose and clarity around what we're supposed to be doing. And I think those are two things that we've struggled with here at CrossRoads for sure, but in the Christian church generally, over this last year and a half, we've struggled with keeping the biggest thing ever, and being very clear in terms of our purpose and mission. If you can take me off the back screen, that would help, but you don't have to. I wouldn't go across the street to listen to myself, and it scares me to watch myself. Anyway, just do what you have to do. What's that? I'm okay behind me. Great. Okay, so that leads me actually to talk about the two critical questions that I think are important for us to wrestle with, because when you lose the biggest thing ever, or it gets diminished, relational breakdowns happen, we lose our purpose. What are the two most significant questions? And entering into, and this may be more optimistic than reality, but entering into a post-COVID world, how do we move forward? What's most important? So the questions I have is, how do we become a healing presence in our world? How do we become a healing presence in our community called CrossRoads? How do we become a healing presence in Red Deer and Central Alberta? And how do we become again a missional presence? Those are two key things I've pondered, because coming out of this, those are the two things that are big issues. How do we see God begin to heal the body and the community? And how do we get our mission back on track to where it should be? And as I thought about that, there's three things that I'm working through, and I'll put them on the table for you. And I think all three of them actually work on both levels. They work towards becoming a healing presence and a missional presence in our world. So I'll raise them for you. One, I think it's so important that we have a fixed reference point. So important that we have a fixed reference point. We live in a highly fluid world, and the targets change, things have changed. We're locked down, we're not locked down, we have a job, we don't have a job, on and on it goes. That. We live in a very fluid context. And in a fluid context, we have to have a fixed reference point, because that gives clarity and orientation for our lives and for our work, a fixed reference point. And our reference point is not so much what we believe, our set of beliefs. It's not necessarily our theology. The fixed reference point is a dynamic connection in real time to the person who sits on the throne in real time. It's this dynamic connection in real time to a real person who sits on the throne at the center of the universe in real time. That's the heart of what we believe, that we know God, and we have a dynamic connection. It's a living one. It's one where we speak, where we listen, where we do life with him. And that's a fixed reference point that can get you through absolutely anything. It doesn't mean that the threats that we face aren't real and aren't out there, but rather we take responsibility for our own lives, and we live in radical dependence on the one on the throne in real time, living in radical dependence on him. He said so many times that he would be a sure foundation for our times. That's either true or it's not true. And we either live into that and with it, or we don't. And when you talk about a healing presence in a world where the culture, where fear is both extreme and pervasive, people have a fixed reference point. They live with that sense of presence and peace that's just very, very attractive. And I think to be a healing presence is to actually live out in our church, in our home, in our workplaces, in our communities, this dynamic relationship in a world where fear is both pervasive and extreme. And it's one of the first things you can do to be healing and a missional presence. Second thing I wrote down for myself is it's so important right now to be very present to our circumstances, very present to our circumstances. It may not be the world as we wish it to be, but that's not the point. This is the world that is before us. Might not be what we wish it to be, but the point is, this is what it is. And for the most part, I found myself at times, and I know other people, we've either lived in the past or we've lived in the future. We've looked back to what we've lost, or we've lived for the benchmarks, you know, the 70%. Then we've lived for these benchmarks, and when you do that, you miss the actual present, which is actually all that we have. This is the day the Lord's made. This is the day we're to rejoice in, not the day when things open up today. They may or may not open up. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if there'll be a fourth. We don't know anything like that. What we have is today. And unless we're very present to our circumstances, we'll miss the opportunities that God is placing right before us. The question is always, what is Jesus doing right now in my world? What is he doing right now? And how is he asking me to engage with him in seeing his kingdom come right now? And so the whole thing right now, I think, is being very present to our circumstances and to the people that are around us, to needs that we can meet. The third thing I wrote down is something we've talked many times about before here, but what becomes critical right now is to practice hospitality. Practice hospitality. It's the key, I think, to going forward, really. Hospitality has always been basic to what it means to be the church. It's always been basic to that. Hospitality is so important right now in a world marked by diversity, by migration, and by polarization. Nothing becomes more important than hospitality. Hospitality is not so much a practice, though I've called it that, as it is a posture. It's first of all a posture before it's a practice. It's a posture that says you matter. It's a posture that says you're welcome. It's a posture that says we accept you no matter where you've been or what you've done. It's a posture that says I have time for you. And before you ever welcome people into your home, you welcome them into your hearts. And right now, as we go forward, you need to know people aren't rushing back. We can't even hit the 30% mark that we're allowed right now. They're not rushing back. And it's not just CrossRoads. I talked to my friend in BC, and they're full open like we are July 1st. They've gone from 0 to 100, just like that. But a lot of their people aren't coming back either. And that's just the reality that we live in right now. So what becomes important is not that we worry about how many people are back or how many aren't back, but that we welcome those that come back. I really need you to welcome people in the name of Jesus. Whether they've been vaccinated or whether they haven't been vaccinated, they're welcome. Doesn't matter. They're welcome. Whether they've not been here for a year and a half and haven't cared and come back, or they have been, doesn't matter. Welcome back. Whether they've left and gone to another church or been mad about something and gone away and in a bit come back, welcome back. It's that posture of hospitality that's going to become critical as we go forward. It's one of the only ways that you can begin to mend some of the fractures that are out there. Just begin to listen to people's hearts, give them time and space. Hospitality requires time. And it's something that I think is absolutely key to going forward. So how do we become a healing presence and how do we become a missional presence? I'd like you to wrestle with those two. I don't have all the answers. There's three things I'm trying to work, but you have better answers. But I think those are two key questions that are so important right now that will help us remember that we're involved in the biggest thing ever. The biggest thing ever is not COVID. The biggest thing ever is not this or that. The biggest thing ever is that the Word became flesh and made his home among us. And he lived and he died and he was raised from the dead. And nothing is bigger than that. And nothing can take that out. Nothing has and nothing will ever take that out. So in the light of that, my fixed reference point is a dynamic relationship with somebody who sits on the throne of the universe. For me, that means stated times of prayer where I listen and speak morning and evening. It means Sabbath once a week where I can have a day to spend in the presence of Jesus. It means times of solitude and silence where I just listen to the God that speaks. I don't know what your practices are around that, but it has to be a dynamic relationship. And then secondly, as I say, not just a dynamic relationship with him, but just trying to be very present to my circumstances, not worry about July 1st or July 4th or whatever it is. I don't want to miss what God's doing tonight. And then reminding myself it's so important to practice hospitality. You're welcome here in the name of Jesus. My neighbor came over last night and had something he wanted to talk about. And I was supposed to go down we had a little party at Menchie's last night because my grandson accepted the Lord into his life. And so thank you, but it was so good. Yeah, actually, can I tell you a story for a minute? Yeah, of course I can. I'm the senior pastor. So he has this sweatshirt on Sunday night. He says to my daughter, I'm wearing this to heaven. Now, he hasn't talked about heaven or God or in Jesus for a long time at all. So they said, so because I'm going to wear it to heaven, can we pray right now? And he just prayed in a simple way, asked if he could accept Jesus into his heart. So then we thought we should have a party. So it was planned for about 8:00, but I get one strip of my lawn done. And my neighbor comes over and he wants to talk. But I need to get the lawn done because we have to get to Menchie's because God's doing something. I was just barely smart enough to turn the lawnmower off, sit and talk to him till we went to Menchie's, and my lawn looks like a mohawk or something with one. But you know what? That's what I mean by being present. There's nothing more important than people, not lawns, not whatever. And if we could practice that, it would sure go a long way to being a healing presence and a missional presence. That's all I really want to say.